program and the Climate Policy and Action program, which is in PACE, Professional and Continuing Education. I encourage you all to check those out. I'm going to start just by reading the Evergreens tribal acknowledgement to get us started, and then I'm going to do some bios of our guests here today who are going to be talking about this issue. Originally, I was going to do a little bit more of an introduction, but I want to make a lot of space for questions and kind of dialogue as well. So Evergreen's Olympia campus is located on the territories of the Medicine Creek Treaty Tribes, which include the Squaxin Island, the Nisqually, and Puyallup tribes. The Squaxin Island tribes' habitation of the land on and around the inlets of the southern Salish Sea include what is now the city of Olympia and our campus here, Evergreen, and that spans thousands of years. Treaty rights established and fought for by tribes are now experiencing new challenges posed by the very issues that we're talking about today, climate change. And I just encourage folks to learn more about these issues through engaging with a lot of the resources that Evergreen has available, including things like the Native Cases collection, which has been constantly updated and includes a bunch of issues around climate change and how that challenges things like treaty rights and indigenous sovereignty. I'd also encourage you to check out things like the Olympia Hidden Histories Project, which is a guided walking tour, which tells you about the history of the downtown Olympia and takes you through a very guided tour and tells you a little bit more about the history of indigenous peoples here. Yeah, and so this is just the first of the lecture series we hold every week 3 and week 7. Sometimes we'll be in this room, sometimes we'll be in the big lecture hall, but that'll occur at the same time. Our next speakers are going to be focusing on, will actually be Steve Niva and his program, actually coming to talk about climate change and its intersections with migration and challenges that are occurring now with increasingly policed borders, right? So very interesting topic, and I encourage folks to come and continue to engage with us through the lecture series. And always you can reach out to me or Michael Joseph, who's the assistant director of the Climate Center, if you're interested in learning more about what we offer in our program. So please do reach out. But enough about that. Please, welcome, please. You can move my bag. Yeah, no worries. So enough about the Climate Center. I wanted to do quick introductions of our guests today. So in the middle here, we have Antonio, who graduated Evergreen in 2020 with a Bachelor's of Arts in Latin American Studies. Greeners, yes. At Evergreen, Antonio researched the relationship between neoliberalism, and maybe we'll learn a little bit more about that today, and global displacement, with a heightened focus on the Mexican countryside, as well as Cold War's impacts on counterinsurgency and social movements in Latin America and the Third World more broadly. He's a member of Economics for Everyone and Palestine Action South Sound. He has organized free political education workshops across the Pacific Northwest and in Mexico, and I'm sure he'd be happy to talk to you more about those opportunities after our session today. Over on my left, your right, Arlo graduated from Evergreen in 2023 with a Bachelor's of Arts in Human Geography, which is also my field, so that's near and dear to my heart. While at Evergreen, he authored and edited several of the Olympia Hidden Histories walking tours, so please do check those out. Studied the political economy of border enforcement and applied a Marxist lens to studies of environmental history, all things I think probably many people in this room are interested in. Since graduating, he's focused his action on Palestine solidarity movements and organizing. His organizing efforts have largely focused on political education, connecting the Palestine movement to a broader anti-capitalist struggle. With an educational background in environmental studies and an organizing background in anti-imperialist solidarity, Arlo sees the connection between climate and Palestine as necessary for the survival of both movements. And last but not least, on your far left here, Pete Bomer has been an activist in movements around these things for quite some time and probably doesn't need introduction. Many people probably know him in this room. He's been involved in anti-racist organizing and solidarity with the people of Vietnam, South Africa, Cuba, Palestine, Central America, Mexico, and against US imperialism and intervention more broadly. For his activism and teaching, he's targeted by the FBI. And just before this, we were talking about FOIA requests of our very public emails that Evergreen logs. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Massachusetts, where he wrote his dissertation on the political economy of racism. He taught political economy at the Evergreen State College from 1987 to 2021, and now is very active in organizing for economic, racial, immigrant, and global justice. His focus now is on Palestine solidarity and organizing for an arms embargo against Israel. He does political economic education in Olympia and in prisons. And he's also the proud parent of 3 sons, a daughter, and 2 grandsons. So please join me in welcoming our guest today to talk about this topic. Okay, so should be good to go. Okay, great. Just so you can use the arrows to advance the slides.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, sure. It's not sharing. Sorry. Cool. Great. Oh, cool.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, the center. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to talk first about a little about the history, then about a little about the movement on BDS against apartheid, and end briefly with a ceasefire, what's going on today. So beginning the area that's today Israel, which is this entire area, the white area on the map, but I'll get to it. So the area that's Israel, in addition, the land occupied by Israel, basically the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. It was just Palestine in the in 100 years ago. About 7% in 1900 was Jewish. The rest was Palestinian. The Zionist movement developed in the late 19th century in Europe, partly as a response to the intense anti-Semitism there. Zionism was and is a belief in a Jewish homeland in Palestine, although the population there, as I already mentioned, was overwhelmingly Palestinian, who are Arab and mainly Muslim, even though a significant number are Christian. Zionism means the right of all Jews to return to what was Palestine, Israel, and the Jewish-dominated state there, even though Zionism, it was a minority among Jewish people before World War II. The problem beginning with Zionism means displacement of local population of most of it, and less rights of the Palestinians who remained in what became Israel. Before World War II and the Holocaust, like I mentioned, Zionism wasn't a major position among Jews around the world, but this changed because of the Holocaust. Also, most nations, including the United States, did not want Jews to migrate there from Europe. In 1948, Israel declared itself a state and violently expelled most of the Palestinian population, what became Israel, which was 78% of historic Palestine. This was called the Nakba to Palestinians, a lot of people around the world, meaning catastrophe in Arabic. 75% of the population in what became Gaza were people who had been expelled from, what was Israel. In 1967, moving up toward the present, Israel went to war with Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, and seized in that war and has continued to occupy the West Bank of Palestine, East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the Golan Heights, which is inside Syria. It is a brutal occupation by Israel that includes the growth of Jewish settlements on the West Bank, the annexation of East Jerusalem, and a brutal blockade in Gaza. Many wars by Israel, they withdrew most of the settlements there in 2005, but many wars by Israel on Gaza since then, murdering many thousands of people, Palestinians in Gaza, before 2023. The U.S. and Israel have an objective, the total domination of the Middle East. Israel serves U.S. elite interests in this immoral project. Obama, for example, pledged and won in Congress $3.8 billion a year to Israel until 2026, from 16 to 26. And since October 23, the U.S. has spent $22 billion in support of Israel since then. The war did not begin on October 7, 2023, like we often hear in the media, when Hamas-led group entered southern Israel and killed 1,200 residents of Israel and took about 250 hostages back into Gaza. I don't support the killing and kidnapping of Israeli civilians on that day, but history does not begin on October 7th, 23. Gaza has been, over the last 20 years, at least, maybe longer, an open-air prison with insufficient food getting in, a blockade of Gaza with continuous murderous incursions into Gaza by the Israeli military. The West Bank, the occupation of the West Bank of Palestine has been ruled illegal by two international courts, the International Criminal Court and the International Criminal Court of Justice. Since at least 1967, Israeli apartheid, I think we can call it Israeli apartheid. This includes 2 million Palestinians or Israeli Palestinians inside Israel's 48 borders with second-class citizen. Then the 5 million people in the West Bank and Gaza, lack of basic rights, lack of self-determination, thousands held in prison without charges, limited access to water and resources. So it's truly apartheid, which means it comes from South Africa, and I'll talk about it in a second, meaning separate and unequal. It was basically a system in South Africa openly in the 20th century until 1990. And in South Africa, just to make clear about apartheid, the Black population was restricted to 13% of the land. They couldn't vote, major repression. Very similar, you might think of more even formalized like Jim Crow in the United States, ruled the United States from the late 1870s until certainly the 60s. Truly horrendous war waged by Israel with total U.S. support the last 2 years, called a genocide by the UN, most human rights groups. Officially, and you've probably seen many pictures and read about, so I'll go very briefly, 67,000 Palestinians officially killed, more than 20,000 children out of a population of a bit over 2 million, tens of thousands under the rubble whose bodies are being found today, a famine, at the least 100 starving to death, destruction by Israel of most hospitals, schools, almost all the housing. Really, it's a war against the people of Gaza, not just Hamas. It's been an Israeli war against the people of Gaza, truly an attempted destruction of the people, a genocide. Two more points before I get to South African things we can learn from here. Anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. Those are two different concepts that a lot of people are trying to use, like I think lies by both U.S. and Israeli leaders that to be anti-Zionist is to be anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism is wrong and continues, but to oppose the idea of a state of Israel where Palestinians are expelled or treated as inferior with less rights isn't anti-Semitic. Nor is what Israel is doing by calling it a crime against humanity. It's not anti-Semitic. It's being used by Trump and the right wing of the United States for those challenging Israel and U.S. support for Israel, especially against universities that control them. I think one of the, it's clear that the Trump administration wants to basically control all independent institutions like universities and is using anti-Semitism, which has so much been a part of fascists, to kind of bring in fascism. It's very, very ironic. Don't let the Trumpists get away with it. A long-run solution to me, whether it's one state or two states, there's a lot of debate about that. It must mean whether it's one state, all of Palestine, or two states, Israel and Palestine, it must be the equality of all people living there, not Jewish domination, and the right of Palestinians to return where they were expelled in 48 and 67, and expulsions continue today. Ethnic cleansing is going on daily in the West Bank, and I think attempt to force the people out of Gaza. Okay, so that's a very brief history, and I could have spent time on it. Let me turn now to BDS briefly. Okay, uh, the slide, Tony. Oh, I'll just talk. Okay, how do I get to the next slide? Here.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So let me say this, it's on the sheet too, okay? My definition is pretty similar. So BDS, which, is a central part of our discussion today, it stands for boycott B, divestment D, and sanctions S. It was a major tactic of the anti-apartheid movement against South Africa in the 1980s. It was a campaign in the US and really much of the world. Boycott, so the first thing, boycott means in the South African context, we can apply it to the Israeli context, say, not buying goods from South African companies and from other corporations investing and profiting from South African apartheid. For example, boycotting banks making loans. Also, and somewhat more controversial then, was a cultural boycott, boycotting, saying entertainers shouldn't go there, sports teams should not go to South Africa. For example, the rugby team from South Africa, there's big protests in the US when they came here. So that's the boycott. The next part, which is directly relevant to Evergreen, is divestment. It means goods, churches, other institutions, universities, getting them to sell stocks and bonds of corporations, including banks that were involved in South Africa, such as General Motors, Citibank. So that's divestment. And the big movement here has been so far unsuccessful to divest Evergreen from having companies involved in supporting Israel. Sanctions, the S, government, mainly federal, not extending loans, not extending aid, no military sales to South Africa. In 86, Reagan, another very racist president, he vetoed the sanctions of South Africa, but at that time, at least, Congress did over, you need 2/3 of Congress overruled him. So the sanctions did go into place late in the movement because of the movement against apartheid. So again, the South African apartheid is separate and unequal, economically, politically, geographically, education, sex was outlawed between blacks and whites, the laws, all of those were formalized as unequal, even though, so apartheid's basically separate but equal and was the overt system in South Africa until 90. So the BDS campaign called for boycott, beginning the first reference I saw by the African National Congress. So I'll get to the leading anti-apartheid group in South Africa, led by Nelson Mandela, called for a boycott of South Africa in the 50s. Martin Luther King in the early 60s also called for a boycott of South Africa as a move, as part of the ideas against apartheid. So like the BDS movement in Palestine, which originally came from civil society in Palestine, the movement originally came from the ANC, Desmond Tutu, a really impressive bishop who called for BDS in the 70s and early 80s. Yeah.
Would apartheid not be separate but unequal, whereas segregation would be separate but equal?
Okay, but I think both, okay, you're right in theory, but I think both, my point is both were separate but equal in practice, right? Like, look, for example, in the South, look at the schools, the resources going to the black schools where black kids went, white schools, shorter time. So I would argue both systems were in fact separate but unequal.
Right, but then in South Africa, they were giving vaccines to African women that were actually meant to sterilize them.
Right. So that's what I say, both, and that happened in the US too, right? So both, I think, were separate but unequal. In fact, it was more formal in South Africa. That's the difference. Okay, but we can discuss in one discussion. Okay, so BDS was effective not so much for the economic cost of South African capital and the South African apartheid state, but basically the movement led to their loss of legitimacy. The sanctions were somewhat costly, but I think most important with the white supporters of apartheid and the ruling class in South Africa felt support of the US was especially important strategically, and they feared the loss of support by the US. That's why I think BDS is so important here. Most important, of course, in ending apartheid was the resistance within South Africa. It was armed resistance that the ANC was involved in, other groups too, but also a mass movement of non-cooperation, the UDF, the United Democratic Front, mass uprisings in South Africa. Note, Palestinian resistance also, we hear about the armed struggle, but there's so many different forms of resistance by movements in Palestine also. Mainly because of the mass resistance within South Africa, and secondly, because of the global apartheid movement and their victories. The apartheid and the ruling National Party, that was the dominant party in South Africa, agreed to negotiate with the African National Congress to dismantle apartheid in 1990. They agreed to, in negotiations, one person, one vote, the end of overtly racist laws, elections, that Nelson Mandela and other political prisoners would be released. Nelson Mandela became president in 1994. While the white elites lost their political power, but they didn't lose their economic power. So it's been the growth of a Black professional managerial class and a Black capitalist class, but still the leadership is overwhelmingly white in a country where the white population is barely more than 10% of the country. So, for example, 50% of the land in South Africa is still owned by whites who are less than 10% of the population. So the absurdity of claims by people like Trump, Tucker Carlson, is that basically that discrimination against white people in South Africa, as you know, Trump is taking in almost no refugees now, the administration, while taking in of the 7,000 refugees, almost all are white South Africans. So this whole thing of, white genocide, racism against whites is, I think, part of the racist campaign in the US and using South Africa in that way. So I think we really need to challenge that. Briefly, my experience with Shell boycott is a group called Pittsburghers Against Apartheid. I lived in Pittsburgh from 84 to 87. Our group was about half Black, and very multiracial, many activities tied to BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions. We're picketing banks. We connected the Black community. For example, we had, I remember, a march. We raised money with a 10K race, and half the money went to the ANC and half went to the anti-poverty efforts in the Black community in Pittsburgh. Beginning in 85, we had weekly pickets every Saturday at a visible Shell station, usually about 20 people, sometimes bigger. We gave out educational forums. We slowed cars down, but we didn't stop them in the end. There were no arrests. It was a national campaign. And one thing that's very strategic, both in regards to South Africa and Israel, they're both dependent on oil imports. There's almost no oil or natural gas they produce themselves. Shell was involved in a major way in apartheid South Africa, including gas stations, Shell selling oil to the South African military. We went to shareholder meetings demanding Shell end their involvement. It hurt Shell image of socially responsible corporation. That was as important as the declining sales. It was a partial victory. Often we make movements, the victories aren't total. Shell agreed to stop being involved in South Africa. They closed all the gas stations. But as far as my research shows, they still sold oil under the table to South Africa, even though they didn't do it openly and they weren't supposed to legally. So my conclusion was apartheid was defeated, although rulers claimed it was invincible, that it was a system forever. But I think just like slavery here, people thought it wouldn't end. I think movements can win. And I said the main cause of ending it was the mass movement uprising in South Africa. But the global anti-apartheid movement, including BDS, played a major role in weakening legitimacy of apartheid, and it led to whites giving up some of their political power. the global movement, at the very least, speeded up the ending of apartheid. As a really great Israeli historian, Ilan Pappé, has stated, the importance of a global solidarity movement with Palestine to end the Israeli occupation. The main argument of supporters of apartheid, that anti-apartheid and the ANC, that they were communist, like the way terrorism and claims of anti-Semitism are used against the Palestine solidarity movement today. So again, before I get to the ceasefire, I think the lessons, the importance of using BDS for broad educational campaigns, customers, workers, at Shell stations, reaching out to the mass media, the need for both moral and strategic arguments. Delegitimizing Shell was as important as was Shell losing customers. A campaign, I think this is true of many things, not just BDS. We need campaigns that are persistent. I heard people say, I went to one demonstration, the war didn't end. I think we need persistent campaign, not one or two actions. And finally, connecting Shell or Chevron boycott to other issues. For example, we connected to Shell's destruction in Nigeria that was going on at the time. So I think connecting the current anti-Chevron BDS campaign to the climate crisis is so important. Okay, finally, briefly, the current ceasefire in Gaza, and I'll do this really briefly. It could be a whole other talk. So Trump announced a week ago a ceasefire and exchange of Palestinian prisoners and Israeli hostages, and allowing in some food and medical and other aid beginning October 12th, 3 days ago. It also included Israeli troops still controlling half of Gaza, but leaving some of the main cities. Hamas and Israel agreed to this part, and the 20 remaining Israeli hostage release. Israel released 1,700 Palestinians detained without charges since October 7th, 2023, 2 years ago, and 250 Palestinian prisoners, but out of 10,000 it holds, so 250 released. I'm happy for the release and the daily bombing and murder by Israel has significantly declined, but there's no justice. The brutal Israeli occupation continues. Israeli troops occupying half of Gaza, even before October 7th and before this one of the most heavily populated places on earth. Trump's 20-point proposal with Netanyahu 2 weeks ago called for disarming of Hamas, but not of Israel. A transitional government in Gaza led by war criminal Tony Blair, ex-prime minister of Great Britain, with no input by Palestinians. There's no mention of the West Bank in this agreement, where Israel has killed over 1,000 Palestinians over the last 2 years, and seizing more and more land by Israeli continues. Israel continues to arm Israel. The underlying illegal, immoral occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem continue. There's no justice. Also, Israel and the U.S. have been never known to uphold agreements, whether it's against Native Americans here in so many places around the world. Likely, sadly, another major Israeli bombing and murderous attack will happen in the not too distant future, especially if the global Palestine solidarity movement continues. It's more important as ever that the movement continues. So it's imperative that the Palestine solidarity movement in general and BDS in particular continue, and that we continue demanding no sending of weapons to Israel. Join us. Thank you.
So we just heard about the BDS campaign against Shell during the time of apartheid South Africa. Some important things to note. One is that Chevron was also present in South Africa, even if it profited less than Shell did. And secondly, it's that even as countries started cutting off diplomatic ties to the apartheid regime, Israel supported that government until the bitter end, supplying a significant part of its weaponry. Weapon development in Israel really took off in 1967. I don't know if I'll have time to get into that, but it's just important things to note. But today, Chevron is the primary corporate antagonist in Israel's violent dispossession, occupation, and apartheid against Palestine, playing the role there that Shell did in South Africa. I called my section Fueling Violence, and most of my talking points can be found in an excellent report called From Economy of Occupation to Economy of Genocide. It was published in July by Francesca Albanese, who was a special rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territory since 2022. In that report, she names corporations who enable the displacement, replacement, and erasure of Palestinian life, exposing the integration of the economies of settler colonial occupation and genocide. One of those corporations, obviously, is Chevron. And in her conclusion, she wrote, quote, "The complicity exposed by the report is just the tip of the iceberg. Ending that complicity will not happen without holding the private sector accountable, including its executives. Particularly in this case, where people's self-determination and very existence are at stake, this is a necessary step to end the genocide and dismantle the global system that has allowed it." In an immediate response to her findings, the US State Department sanctioned her. In the retaliatory press statement written by our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, he wrote, "Albanese has spewed open contempt for the US, Israel, and the West. She recently escalated this effort by threatening dozens of entities worldwide, including major American companies across finance, technology, defense, energy, recommending that the International Criminal Court pursue investigations and prosecutions of these companies and their executives. We will not tolerate campaigns of political and economic warfare which threaten our national interest and sovereignty." And when Marco Rubio says that condemnations of corporate entities threaten our sovereignty and national security, what he is saying is that they threaten the freedom to commit violence in the name of accumulation through dispossession. And I find that exchange extremely illuminating on many levels. I'll reference it during my conclusion, but first, let me just give a basic outline of what I'm hoping to talk about today. Starting with some anecdotes on Chevron, which are covered in this excellent zine, which I just saw for the first time today. But basically, you know, in the zine, it covers the oil spill where Chevron intentionally dumped 16 billion gallons of toxic waste in the Amazon rainforest. And recently, as little as 2 weeks ago, there was an explosion in the city of El Segundo, California. And I think it's important to note that, you know, with that case in the Amazon, Chevron not only did not pay what they were found guilty of, they also ended up countersuing, and the leading lawyer for the people of Lago Agrio was this man, Stephen Dosinger, who ended up getting disbarred and sent to prison for basically standing up for the rights of the Kofan people in Ecuador. So I think we see a pattern here where Chevron has a history of climate catastrophe that's ongoing, knows no borders, and that they often operate with impunity. So now let's turn to Israel's role in Chevron Palestine. Seconds. So again, a lot of this stuff is actually covered in the zine, but basically Chevron is the largest producer of natural gas for Israel, and Chevron's the largest multinational corporation with a significant stake in Israel's energy sector. It's providing the resources and services that Israel requires for its energy-intensive, tech-driven obliteration of Gaza. The Israeli Electric Corporation, whose primary contracts are with Chevron, supplies electricity to all branches of the Israeli government and the vast majority of Israeli households. The Israeli Electric Corporation depends on Chevron since 71% of the electricity produced in Israel in 2023 used fossil fuel, most of which was supplied by Chevron's Tamar gas field, which I'll get to in a second. And just a note is that Gaza, in particular, has long lacked the electricity needed for a dignified existence, but obviously that situation has worsened, has intensified and worsened since October 2023 when the genocide began. And as it was mentioned earlier, Israel is a small country with a relatively large army and an air force, which means there's a significant overlap between its civilian and military fuel supply chains. In essence, all Israeli military bases, prisons, and police stations, as well as Israel's illegal settlements and outposts in the occupied West Bank, rely on Chevron. And Chevron claims that it mostly provides Israel with civilian infrastructure, but companies that supply Israel with coal, gas, oil, or fuel are contributing to civilian infrastructure that Israel uses to entrench permanent annexation in the West Bank and or weaponize in the destruction of Palestinian life in Gaza. The ostensibly civilian nature of such infrastructure does not exonerate a company from responsibility. So now let's take a closer look at the pipelines of Israel and the revenue streams it provides. Essentially, Chevron extracts natural gas from the Leviathan and Tamar fields and profits from its part ownership and operation of the East Mediterranean gas pipeline, pictured here. One factor for Israel's intensification of their naval blockade of Gaza was securing the Tamar gas supply and protecting this pipeline. It's through this pipeline that Israel exports gas to Egypt and Jordan. And it's also important to note that it's through this naval blockade that the Samud flotilla was intercepted, and those trying to bring aid were detained and beaten in Israeli prisons, a situation that is familiar to many, many Palestinians. Israel collects hundreds of millions of dollars in royalties and fees from Chevron's extraction projects. This is also mentioned in the zine, is that in 2023, this amounted to over $820 million. And if that's what Israel collected from Chevron, just imagine how many billions Chevron raked in from this partnership. So Chevron and Israel profit from one another. And meanwhile, since the genocide began in October 2023, Israel has cut off most of Gaza's energy, leaving Palestinians without electricity or fuel. It's destroyed most of its water pumps. Most hospitals and forms of transportation have reached the brink of total collapse. There's been massive destruction of sanitation systems, which has contributed to a resurgence of polio, and vital desalination plants were forced to shut down. So this is not only a genocide that's occurring in Gaza, but a ecocide, a deliberate destruction of an entire social and ecological fabric. Some key stats here is that only 1.5% of cropland is still accessible and suitable for cultivation. In Gaza, 5.7 liters per day is the available amount of drinking water as of February 2025. And for context, the average American uses roughly 300 liters per day, according to the EPA. And something that's important to note is that even before the genocide, only 30% of households in Gaza had daily water access. And so essentially, I think what we're seeing in Gaza is the culmination of a global economy that runs on crude oil, which is why I called my section The Fuel of Violence. And so I think I just want to give a little brief lesson in US history, global power, its history of global power, and its ties to oil. So by 1945, with just 6% of the world's population, the US had 40% of the world's electrical power and 59% of its proven oil reserves. That second number has dwindled as oil production in the Middle East has soared to meet the relentless demands for Washington's carbon-fueled economic order. The US remained the world's main source of carbon dioxide emissions throughout the 20th century, although today China holds that position. After World War II, the US built an empire of unprecedented global power while espousing liberal principles. Instead of respecting international sovereignty, like it claimed, like Marco Rubio claimed,
Washington's modus operandi has been to advance its global dominion and protect its extraordinary wealth and power. Through the strength of its economic, military, diplomatic, and clandestine capabilities, it has constructed a world order that runs on crude oil. The genocide in Gaza is temporarily suspended, but the economy of occupation that allowed for it to happen continues. Former U.S. Secretary of State Alexander Haig once called Israel the empire's anchor in the Middle East, saying it was, quote, the largest American aircraft carrier in the world that cannot be sunk. And it's important to note here, although the focus of today's talk is Chevron, is that many of those aircrafts have been bomber jets made by the Boeing Corporation, which obviously has a long history here in the Pacific Northwest, and many of those bomber jets have used Chevron oil. So unless Israel's US-backed war crimes are challenged by a global network of resistance from below, extractive firms like Chevron will continue to grease the machinery that reduces the planet into a zone of sacrifice and makes Gaza unlivable for Palestinians. Imperialism is not just perpetrated by nation states. Corporations like Chevron both drive and benefit from imperialism. We should not reduce the story of US imperialism, however, into a story of oil grabs. But the fact of the matter is that US hegemony has relied on crude oil to feed the insatiable needs of a global economy made in its image. In order to truly oppose occupation and empire, we must implicate the public-private relationships like the one shared between the US, Israel, and Chevron. Please don't buy gas from Chevron and keep on fighting for a free Palestine. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you again to Tony and Peter for providing that history, both of BDS and of Chevron. We're going to turn now to the current ongoing Chevron campaign. And before we get into it, I want to note that the ceasefire that was signed on October 8th is an important step for immediate cessation of the genocide in Gaza. But as Peter noted in his talk, it is by no means a reason to slow our mobilization here, given that it's backed only by the word of the United States, which, as Peter said, is worth basically nothing. So it's all the more reason to keep going for Free Palestine. Chevron became a target in the environmental movement in the 1970s when two things happened. One was that the climate movement gained broad popularity in the United States. And two is that it began to expand its Richmond refinery in response to a changing energy market domestically. Between 1964 and 1992, Texaco, which is owned by Chevron, dumped, as Tony mentioned, billions of dollars of polluted water into the Amazon. And in response to that, Amazon Watch organized the first global anti-Chevron day in 2014. So that's the kind of climate side of this movement. Chevron became a BDS target in 2022. In 2020, Chevron purchased Noble Energy Systems, and in doing so, entered the Israeli energy market. And so in 2022, BDS placed Chevron as a business on the BDS list. And then in 2024, it became a priority target, meaning that it is of the campaigns that is of the most importance for the boycott, divest, sanctions movement. The campaign has continued to grow since then, with notable mobilizations in September 2024, when Greta Thunberg and Naomi Klein joined the movement. And then again in May 2025 for this year's Global Anti-Chevron Day. And Chevron is a particularly good target because, one, it's very easy to boycott. You know, unlike some other targets like Microsoft, where it is actually extremely difficult to do a consumer boycott, Chevron is really easy because there are a lot of other gas stations that everyone can go to. And so it is actually achievable to get a consumer boycott off the ground. And the second reason is that they are very new to the Israeli energy market. Again, they only entered the market in 2020, so this is not like a historically precedented investment of theirs. This is a new entry of their market. Boycott, I'll answer questions at the end. Thank you. Boycott campaigns work particularly well when they are organized around a particular target. It is really important to not personally buy things on boycott lists, but boycott campaigns are concerted, organized efforts, not just a collection of individuals boycotting a single target. Boycott campaigns use collective power to try and basically do three things. One is give the campaign large visibility so that it is actually something that can be seen and interacted with. Two is use direct disruption to disrupt everyday business operations and slow down companies' profit. And then the third is to make specific demands and use the boycott movement as leverage to achieve those demands. So it's not just a kind of wanton boycott movement. It actually has specific things that it's asking for involving divestment from Israel. At the international level, Boycott Chevron as a campaign is supported by a couple of large organizations like the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, Oil and Gas Action Network, American Friends Service Committee, the Democratic Socialists of America, Amazon Watch, and others. Here in Olympia, we launched our Chevron BDS campaign in May 2025, along with Tacoma for this year's Global Anti-Chevron Day. That day, 25 cities around the world also saw actions take place. That same month, Chevron reported its largest quarterly loss, meaning its profits are declining, not that it's losing money, but that its profits are going down. And the Swiss National Bank divested its entire stake from the Chevron Corporation. It sold every share it owned. Also, as of now, the outstanding shares in Chevron are in its sharpest decline in 15 years. And while it is actually difficult to attribute any of these things directly to the Boycott Chevron campaign, what it does mean is that Chevron is vulnerable to economic sanctions. And so if we are able to mobilize a massive boycott movement, they are more vulnerable than a company that is on the ascendance. There are basically four types of campaigns in this Boycott Chevron campaign. The first is franchise divestment. This is hung in the window of a Chevron station in Florida. Franchise divestment campaigns focus on trying to get franchise owners to call on the Chevron Corporation to stop, divest from Israel, or to cut relations with the Chevron Corporation. Almost all Chevron gas stations that you see are franchises, which means that they're not owned by the corporation itself. It means that an individual or a separate corporation owns the station. It's branded by Chevron and it gets supplied by Chevron fuel. But any profit that the station makes actually goes to the third party, not necessarily the Chevron Corporation. There has been limited success here in Florida. Another really big target is Hassan & Sons, which is a company in Oregon and California, which owns several hundred Chevron stations. But there's been no real mobilization there so far. The second type of campaign is a sponsorship campaign. This is where you target events with Chevron as corporate sponsors to try and delegitimize Chevron as a corporation by getting them removed from sponsors. So this is a picture from the Colfax Marathon in Colorado, which, following pressure from this year's marathon, dropped Chevron from its 2026 sponsors list. This is just one example of an action that they took. Others where they actually got marathon runners to wear Boycott Chevron apparel, so that in the marathon itself, it was a very visible campaign. The third type of divestment campaign is an institutional divestment campaign. And this is going after institutions with large amounts of money and pressuring them to divest from Chevron. So this could be cities or transit authorities that use Chevron fuel for their vehicles, or it could be banks or other financial institutions that hold large amounts of stake in Chevron. Alameda County, which is east of San Francisco, it's Oakland and Berkeley, just became the first county to divest from Israeli apartheid, including from Chevron. And as mentioned prior, the Swiss National Bank in May divested its entire stock from Chevron. Additionally, the largest single investor in the world, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, cut its Chevron shares by not a full percentage point a little bit less than that, alongside several other oil companies following calls to reduce climate emissions. And then the final type of campaign is direct corporate pressure. And that is what we do in Olympia. So there are, while a majority of Chevron stations are franchises, there are several hundred that are corporately owned. And the only corporately owned stations in the country are in Washington, Oregon, and California. So us on the West Coast are particularly well set up to do corporate pressure campaigns because we actually have access to a direct revenue supply for Chevron. In Olympia, we have had a biweekly picket outside of the Trosper Road Chevron station, which is one of two corporately owned Chevron stations in the South Puget Sound area, as a way to build momentum and also directly cut profits for Chevron, as well as stain its corporate image, which, as mentioned, was a really important part of the campaign for Shell Oil. Over the summer, in an attempt to kind of expand the campaign outside of Olympia, or rather connect other campaigns that are already happening outside of Olympia into a kind of cohesive project, organizers in Olympia, Tacoma, and Seattle put together what is now called the West Coast Boycott Chevron Coalition. And this is a coalition of organizations and campaigns that are working specifically on Boycott Chevron. It is in 4 West Coast states. And it's largely groups that already existed that were already doing Chevron organizing and that came together to like collect our efforts into one cohesive thing. So on August 29th, we had our first call to action, which was a freeway banner drop. This is a picture from, I think, Fullerton, California. But there were also actions in 23 other West Coast cities. And I'm just going to go through and name them so you can get a sense for the kind of regionality of this action. There were banner drops in Bellingham, Whidbey Island, Montlake Terrace, Bellevue, Seattle, Wenatchee, Tacoma, Olympia, Vancouver, Portland, Salem, Albany, Ashland, Sacramento, Berkeley, Bakersfield, Santa Clarita, Burbank, Los Angeles, Pomona, Orange County, Oceanside, and San Diego. And several of those cities had multiple actions, like Seattle and LA had several across the city. An anecdote from that day is that one person stopped in Bellevue and said they had come from Portland and asked organizers why they had seen so many Chevron banners. It was a campaign that they had not heard of before, and left having had a conversation about Chevron. There are several ways for you to plug into the campaign. One is by joining the Evergreen Peace Coalition, which Brady has a sign-up sheet that we can pass around at the end. And the other is to come to our actions. So again, they are bi-weekly at the Trosper Road Chevron station. You can take a picture of this flyer if you would like. It has the address, time, location. The next one is a week from today on Wednesday, October 22nd at 5 p.m. We stay for an hour and a half, and then we disperse. We also have another regional action coming up. So that coalition that I mentioned has called for another regional action on November 22nd. That's still being organized, but keep your eye out for that because that will be a really important mobilization. And I just want to conclude by saying that Chevron is a really rare opportunity to stitch together the climate movement and the struggle against international imperialism. Finding opportunities to bind our movements together to exert collective force has the potential to build the kind of movement that can pose a real challenge to the current extractivist, imperialist, and capitalist status quo, and build toward climate justice in a meaningful way. Thank you.
So yeah, thank you so much for your talks, and I appreciate each of the different sections, starting with some of the history and learning from anti-apartheid struggles in other parts of the world and how oil and fossil fuels are involved. I think that's probably going to be a source of some questions, like how these two movements are connected. Really appreciate the connections both to the ongoing struggles right now and to the local movement right now too. So I just wanted to open it up for questions for the folks in the room. See if you have questions for our panel. Let's start. There's two back there, so yeah.
All right, well, I had a question about the Chevron thing. So you know how Chevron and Exxon is one company. not really that far away. Should we boycott Exxon as well?
So the current campaign is specifically targeting Chevron because it specifically has ties to Israel's genocidal campaign. It's not that other oil companies are good, but it's that Chevron is specifically bad. And we're trying to exert collective force to like stop them from doing worse atrocities, and then we can address them. So the short answer is no. So Chevron specific.
Okay, I was mainly asking because of their close cooperation.
Yeah.
So that like maybe if the boycott effectively works on Chevron to divest something, then they might just talk to Exxon and say, hey, buy this real quick. Because I'm about to sell it because I got a lot of attention from me right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that is true, and that is also true of basically any other oil company, you know, like if Chevron leaves the Israeli energy market, then there is an opportunity for any other oil company to enter the Israeli market. But the idea is that by forcing Israel out, by forcing Chevron out, it makes it more difficult for other companies to enter the market because they're going to face the same pressure that Chevron faced. And so it's like by virtue of getting Chevron out and prevent others from getting in.
Well, I guess I'm just kind of like thinking about it from how what was your name again, sir, Paul?
Peter.
Peter, yes, how you were mentioning how when Shell got pressured in the apartheid Africa, that they really ended up just still selling anyway, just under the table.
Right.
So that's kind of why I'm bringing up this Exxon, connection here, because that would be essentially them doing it under the table, right? And they're connected, not just like any other world. Like, they were one company like 50 years ago.
They always stand at one of the Rockefellers. It was one company that broke them up into a few, but still a few companies dominate the world. You're right, it's one company.
Yeah, that was another question.
I did have a question about kind of related to that, but you're talking about how Shell, they still did it on the table, and I'm wondering if there are things we can learn from that, bring into this, and how we can educate moving forward, and how we can adjust strategies because of what we've learned from African part. Is there things that you have observed that you think could apply to this, that you think we can learn?
Good and difficult question. I mean, one thing is that just whether it's this ceasefire, which really is not very permanent, very dangerous, like we've mentioned, just because Shell said they stopped selling oil, they didn't. I don't have the numbers in front of me. The sales did decline significantly. So I think, again, like that's why I said it was a partial victory. And I think often, maybe as an aside, I think when movements win things, people in power will never say they won, they'll say it for some other reason. Like, for example, many years ago, there was a major campaign, Evergreen, to stop a company, Marriott, from selling food here, because they also sold food in prisons, and there were many other reasons, treating workers badly, bad food. There was a major campaign, including disrupting trustees movement, teach-ins, demonstrations, and Evergreen eventually canceled the contract, but they said it was because some budget didn't work out. But somebody who was a dean at the time actually told me it was 100% because the movement and afraid of the boycott. So my point is, Shell too, they're never going to say it's because of the movement. We often underestimate our power. So I don't know, that's going to be a lesson, but I think the victories, like you said, are very partial also.
Oh, sorry, I did have one more question. I know that the Chevron movement has made a map of each gas station that is a Chevron gas station or a Texaco gas station. And sometimes gas stations have different names, but they still use Chevron gas. Do you have a list of Olympia gas stations that are Chevron, like, supplied gas stations that may not be exclusively like Chevron posted outside of it?
So, in Olympia, as to the best of my knowledge, the gas stations that use Chevron gas are branded by Chevron and Texaco, and then Caltex is the third, but they're not in Olympia. So I guess what you're looking for is like Texaco is a gas station that is like owned by Chevron. There are 2 corporate locations and the rest are franchises, but it's important to boycott all of them.
Other than the AIPAC's influence on our elections, why do you think it's so hard for US politicians to call it a genocide? Even like Bernie Sanders, who's not necessarily gonna be like out big in his own race. Why do you think it's so hard for them to just say what it is?
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, I think we've seen that the Democratic Party has paid a heavy cost for refusing to flat out call it genocide and to basically maintain support despite some degree of like criticisms and rhetoric towards Israel's genocide. But I think also what we're seeing right now is, I mentioned that China is now the leading emitter of fossil fuels, and that in part we can interpret as a story about the rise of Chinese economic power. And so I think it doesn't explain it all, but one thing to understand is that as US's international power declines, it really does need kind of like all of the allied states it can maintain. So I think specifically with Israel, as there's a project called the Abraham Accords, which essentially is an initiative to maximize economic efficiency and security interests between US allies in the Middle East, including Israel. And it's a project that's designed to create kind of a Middle East political economic order that erases Palestine from that future. And so I think just one reason to see this like close relationship between the US and Israel is not just AIPAC, but rather like the importance of the US basically trying to maintain its position as the world's leading hegemon while Chinese power basically is ascending.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. So there's 2 main explanations for why Israel and the US have been so close. Certainly, the US was the first country in the world to recognize Israel in 48, and actually the Soviet Union was second, which is kind of ironic. But certainly since 67, when Israel went for what I told you, seized Gaza, Golan Heights, West Bank, and East Jerusalem, the US totally supported. So the US and Israel have been like this. So these are the 2 main alternatives. And I agree with Antonio. I tend to agree with the second. One is the influence of AIPAC. Sometimes the Jews having too much influence, often anti-Semitic, or maybe the Christian evangelicals, which certainly are the military. So certainly that's a factor. But I would argue the other reason, which I try to hint at indirectly, is that basically, and Tony mentioned a comment, that Israel has served US imperialist interests. And when I said in my talk, I think if we look what's going on today, is the Democrats and Republicans, they've been, I think, equally bad. The way Biden kind of enables some of the stuff, Trump and some of the stuff. I think the thing is the US-Israel project to dominate the Middle East. Therefore, the destruction of Iran, Israel is bombing, I don't know how many countries it can keep track, Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, Palestine, at least Iran for sure, right? So what? Yeah. So I do think it's this project to dominate, and I think it's basically, I look at it more that US is the dog, Israel's the tail. You understand what I mean? So, but I think we need to challenge both. I mean, some specific stuff Israel does, like for example, when they bombed negotiation in Qatar, it's not clear to me. That's another country, right? It's not clear to me the US supported. I mean, a lot of people said they did, and but the US Trump claimed they didn't know. We know much we can believe them, right? So there may have been a difference. I'm not sure, but in general, it seems we have to look at the US from Israel supporting the US and displaying this really horrific US support for Israel over the last 60 years.
We have a couple questions from chat. There's kind of 2 sets that are paired. So there's one is Chris GS. Is there any quantifiable evidence showing whether the boycott effort is having an effect? And kind of the second part of that is they sometimes running customers saying that they doubt it will make any difference. Do we have an answer for them?
Yeah, so at the moment, like I said in my talk there, it is difficult to attribute Chevron's economic activity to the boycott Chevron campaign. So I guess the simple answer there is no. And the reason that the boycott Chevron campaign is one that's worth pursuing is because, again, it's easy to organize, and Chevron is new to the Israeli energy market. And I guess the third is that they are potentially vulnerable. You know, like Chevron, has economic vulnerabilities that may at the moment not be attributable to the campaign. But that doesn't mean that a larger campaign couldn't exploit those. And so, yeah, I would say that's my answer to that.
I was gonna add to that question. A really major strategist of the boycott rates campaign, and I'm going back to a lot of the United Farm Workers, which they won. Greg Ross was very close to Cesar Chavez, who was the leader of the farm workers. He argued when studies that if you can reduce the sales of the company by 10%. A boycott's going to be very effective in changing policy. The reason is because corporations have a lot of fixed costs. So that last 10% is where often they make their profits. So if you can reduce sales by 10%, you're going to have an effect. And it's been shown in other, campaigns too. So I don't think the boycott Chevron is anywhere near the 10% yet, at least not looked at. But I think that's a way of thinking about how to win.
There's 3 questions. The third,
Has there been any lobbying or organizational effort to go towards local, state, federal representatives and lawmakers to get them involved with this movement or come out saying they're for or against it?
There have been some adjacent campaigns. There's one that I think is being bottom line by the JDP and the American Friends Committee, Jewish Voice for Peace, big national organization, that is going after the Washington State Investment Board. So that is kind of in that direction. For the most part, the campaign has been very grassroots and not focused a ton on electoral politics or elected officials. But there have been campaigns against political bodies like Alameda County. I think the more effective campaigns are going to go after a specific group, company, organization, or political grouping like a county that has stake in Chevron, as opposed to just the Washington State Capitol. And so for example, if a transit system uses Chevron fuel, that would be a good one to go after. Although, yeah, Washington state lawmakers, or even less so national lawmakers, have proven pretty bad on Palestine as a whole. And so there's no reason to think they'd be better on Chevron.
I would also say that as campaigns, whether it's targeting, institutional divestment or corporate locations the way that we are, it's when they can get steam and momentum that can make it easier for political lawmakers to be willing to stand behind this kind of movement if they think there's a strong on the ground kind of movement that will support it, and that's increasing public demand for these kind of movements.
And also, the 4 of us are all active in the Palestine Action of South Sound Pass. We've been going about 2 years, and since the Israeli war began, and one of our committees is the legislative committee, and a major focus of the legislative committee has been getting the city of Olympia to divest. And we're probably going to vote very soon, but some feel like in many places doing it. But I think there's been enough support to sort of pass. We meet the first Monday of every month. We try to talk for what it's about. I know there's a big demonstration in Oak Kingston on Saturday against Trump that I hope people go to. And we're going to have the Palestine Action from Southside Rachel Corrie Foundation, named after a woman named Rachel Corrie, who just 5 people know about it. Every student was killed in Gaza. They're trying to defend a house that the Israeli military was when destroyed. They ran over them many times. So the Rachel Corrie Foundation and Palestine Act shouts out, we're gonna have to pay for their salaries and drop by. And so anyway, our committee, I think people feel, I'm not on that committee, feel we're having success about getting Olympia, investments. There's also been a movement with everything that like something you know about so far in 24 that so far has not been successful.
Okay, so in regard to the so-called peace plan, I think it's very laughable to call it a peace plan. And like from the neglection of the Palestinian interests on the table, and you almost comedic like wanting to disarm Gaza as a whole and to revoke their right to defend themselves. A Palestinian Middle East analyst, Maroun Rabani, called it a renewed Oslo process with an even lower political ceiling. And we're thinking about the ceasefire agreement, right? Like Israel killed 9 Palestinians yesterday for crossing an imaginary yellow line. They maintain occupation of 58% of the land, most of the fertile land in Gaza. So they're, stealing Palestinians' food sovereignty. And as we've seen, like this, like slow motion killing of their neighbors in Syria and Lebanon, from an international community has been deemed sort of acceptable. And so my question here is, like, with this lack of accountability for Israel, what is the historical precedent for that, and what are the implications of that, especially when we see much larger, even more nuclear armed imperial states like Russia and China getting more aggressive in their imperial activity?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a really good summary. Yeah, to call it a peace plan, is laughable. I try to say in my talk, it seems very likely. I mean, we're sure Israel's going to continue attacks, but I think of so Israel and US not following agreements. There was a ceasefire that Israel signed in Lebanon. I don't remember exactly when, almost a year ago, I believe it was. What? Just about it. Yeah, and Israel has continued attacks, not every day, not at the level that they were doing it in southern Lebanon before, but those attacks continue, even though they agreed to not do it. So I think that's going to happen in Palestine. I'm worried about a full-scale war, breaking. I think it's a little bit of a breathing now. Hopefully, the Palestine National Resistance Movement can get together. They're really divided. That they can make gains. People who could have helped bring that movement together, like Marvin Agudi, a prisoner. Israel would not release, even though Hamas did ask for that person to release. What I was trying to say in the talk was the stronger movement, not just the US, but globally, the more you put pressure on the US to do the right thing globally, that Israel not be able to do the right thing, the more there's chance of a lot of full-scale war breaking out. But if you ask me pessimistic, I think it's a temporary ceasefire, which I do support, but it's nothing to do with justice, like you mentioned, that half the land or more is still being occupied by Israel in Gaza.
I would maybe just say that within Palestine, there's like a famous quote, critical of Hamas saying, Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. It was a critique saying Bill Clinton said, we offered this once in a lifetime peace process to Palestinians that they destroyed because they're irresponsible. The reality is that actually resistance groups there vehemently opposed all the negotiations for peace in Madrid and Oslo, and intentionally wanted to destroy that peace agreement, which they viewed as unacceptable. I say that to say that I think Palestinian resistance can and will maintain its infrastructure and continue despite the peace process, because we do know obviously that Israel is going to violate this peace agreement. That's the only type of parallel I can offer.
Just the BDS movement, all the Muslim groups since its formation has basically argued self-determination in Palestine. And that is very much, and that's such a basic demand for Palestine, and that basically is nowhere even mentioned in the treaty that you mentioned. And to me, I try to say again in my talk, I'll repeat, I think self-determination, it's not up to people outside. It could be one state, Palestine, with people having full rights, because not one state with Jewish people dominate, or it could be two states where, you know, people in Palestine, let's say, beginning on the 22% of the land, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, where Palestine told we have to close all the settlements, because, you know, there are more and more settlements by Israel, where they're just taking more and more land in the West Bank. Palestinians have the right to return to the minority of the land, and over time, hopefully we can move for one state, but I think it's up to people there, but I think this idea of Palestinians having a major say over their fate is so missing, and that's, I think, still what we need to support.
There's a few more questions, so I thought you were going first, and then we'll go.
Yeah, I guess over the last 9 months or so, we've seen a lot of these like economic blackouts in economies. One day kind of unspecific, usually on social media, a 1 day boycott campaign, very unspecific, just don't buy anything, don't want riot transportation, anything like that. Can you talk about, what have you expand on why it's important to have a specific target on a specific campaign where you do in-person actions and not just social media?
Yeah.
I'll just start by saying that one, you know, these campaigns often don't leave social media, and so if you're doing like a individual boycott of something and it's not articulated to the rest of society, then it's not really interpreted by people that it's a boycott because of the cause. I think secondly, you know, often people view ethical consumption as a way to contribute to justice. But again, I think it's very difficult to go to a store and look at every single thing that you're purchasing, which is why it's, I think, much more efficient and effective to join a collective campaign, which is what BDS and boycotts do. They collectivize this kind of sentiment by targeting one profiteer and then moving on to the other one. But for Chevron, I think, as was mentioned at the very beginning of the Q&A, the idea is not that we're in favor of other oil corporations, that once we target Chevron and hopefully make a dent in the way it benefits from the misery of Palestinians, that can target other oil companies. So I think it's important to have effective collective boycotts and not just kind of view our individual consumption as a be all end all.
Yeah, and I would just add that on the front of like functionality, boycott campaigns are dealing with corporations that have revenue, like large revenues. And so single day economic blackouts aren't really going to affect the company's bottom line. And so while it's like a cool sentiment, it doesn't really achieve, even if it had goals, which usually these 1 day economic blackouts don't really, even if it were to have goals, it would be like very difficult to achieve that in a single day. The idea with BDS is that a prolonged boycott campaign is able to actually slow down and like shrink the economic sphere, economic size of a company to the degree that it actually is forced to make changes. And so it's one, that it's a collective force, and two, that it's over sustained time.
And I do thank the show.
And then we'll go here and then we'll wrap up, but we'll invite people to stay after these next few questions if you have further questions.
So this is from JJ. They have kind of a three-parter, they're kind of all connected. If we show up the Chevron station, are there signs, but these are all kind of around boycott and protest? Are there signs provided, or do we have to bring our own? Another question also is, will these boycotts at Chevron station continue past October? And the last one is just out of curiosity, where the second South Sound station is, that's owned by Chevron.
Yeah, so just super quickly, yes, there are signs. Yes, it continues past October. There'll be every 2 weeks. This flyer is just the October flyer, but it's every 2 weeks, continuing. I guess we plan out until the end of the year, but we'll continue beyond that as well. And then the third question, the other station's in Hawks Prairie, which is like Eastern Lacey.
Yeah. Thank you. That's all. Chat.
Many of us here are like new activists, and we're coming into our young adulthood. How do you recommend that we both encourage engagement in our peers, but also avoid political apathy at a time that feels very restrictive and frankly, I think hopeless?
So I often use, great question. No easy answers. So I don't, I've been active a long time, like everything in introduction. I think we need to think of ourselves as marathon runners for just liberation, not sprinters. Occasionally at the sprint, for example, with genocide, I think it means like more than just a long run, but I think not throwing yourself out, having a long run, focus is really important. I think secondly, secure things. I think having that, so I'll say for me, basically, at some point, I thought Vietnam was a mistake, but as I began to study what that after, I think having analysis, like historical analysis, learning from movements, learn what capitalism is, that it can be reformed, but it can never be made, any alienation can never be made just. So I think having analysis is important, and maybe thirdly, say I reflect more, is like I think a lot of my age, why haven't they stayed active long run? Because actually, who's going to be involved in the long run? And I hope we are. Is I think having anger and injustice, not maybe anger if somebody cuts you off on the road, but I mean, I think focusing not so much making individuals, but anger and injustice that what's going on, that our humanity is built by being involved, and winning is really important, but also I think, being able to look yourself in the mirror, being involved, building, I guess the last thing I'll say is and I think this is often lacking, building a community among people active, not a cliquish community. The danger of community is, you act superior to everybody else. I think arrogance is such a problem with people on the left, but I think building a community that inclusively can support each other, because we're not going to get support from society. Compared to the 60s, okay, when I got involved, right, it was never a majority, that's kind of, BS. But I think often activists and candidates respected. Now I think we're less respected. I think in finding that community, we can work together. I think people see the problem as much as possible. There's a lot of feeling of hopelessness. We can't stop Trump, we can't stop fascism, we can't stop climate crisis. It's so existential. But I think at least by trying, we have a chance.
I also think it's very important to have analysis driven campaigns and actions. I think what often happens is, especially people who are prone to apathy, is that they will kind of turn their energy inward, kind of on snapping on people who are actually closer proximity than politically than the very people who they're opposing. And so I think it's really important to have a long-term mentality and a goal of moving from theory to actions, because I often think like what happens, people who are like sympathetic leftist ideals end up basically turning their organizations into discussion groups, which is very important to discuss theory and practice. But ultimately, if you don't start doing action, the likelihood of turning on one another, I think, becomes very high.
I want to add, because I think the two of them focused on analysis, which is really important to know where you are and what you're trying to accomplish. I think also organization is really important. I'm someone that believes that having people to do organizing projects with is really important. And even in a world where you have the intention of developing a correct political analysis and then transforming it into some kind of political praxis, is actually very difficult to pull off if you're just doing it on your own. And so I think it is really important to find people that also want to be organizing with you, or find projects in your proximity that you find compelling, and joining a collective people,
Cool. Thanks so much. That was great. Then on, and thanks everyone for coming. I really appreciate it. Let's give a round of applause. How long are you guys gonna stick around and maybe answer questions? People want to. Okay, so feel free to say hi and ask questions to you about.
If you mind elaborating on that?
Thank you so much. Sorry, I didn't.
I'm gonna leave the meeting, Michael.
Is that?
I'm gonna leave the meeting here.
Yes.